Howdy, folks. Last class we went over some array functions, and during one of the breakout rooms, I actually derived one of them for people, and people found it useful, so I thought I'd make a video on it. So, what are the three array functions? Well, there's forEach, which essentially loops over the array. There is filter, which loops over the array and lets you return a Boolean, and anything you return true, that it creates a new array that that particular element has exists in. Map loops through the array and creates a new array with whatever you return. So each one of them is fairly useful for a number of reasons. So we're going to go over them. So let's say I have an array here. Just, very simple. So let's look at forEach first. ForEach is the ability to just basically loop over an array, but as a function. Why is that useful? Well, it's there's a couple times that might be useful. One, because it's a very common way to loop over an array with a forEach loop, which in JavaScript looks like this. Oops, let's use let array. And if you haven't seen this before, this is actually very similar to the regular for loop that we've seen. So if I run this, you can see it just prints out everything. This is basically the same thing as a standard for loop. Oops, listen array dot length I plus plus element equals array I console.log element. These two do the same thing. Well, yeah, kind of, if this is a const. But you can see this is a little bit easier to use. It's easier because there's a bunch of different statements here you have to do. You have to do this extra statement to pull out the element. You have your I counter. So we use this. It's just a nicer way of looping through an array. But sometimes you're looping through an array, you want to use a syntax, but you also want to have the index. And you notice in our previous one, our index is actually I, and we have the element. So we have the I, we have the element, so we could always use this for. But the forEach is just nicer. And so sometimes we want to have both. We want to have our cake and eat it too. And so that's when the forEach function comes into play, because you can actually get the element and the index out of it, as well as the array that you're iterating over. The reason this can be kind of nice too is it can be very functional. So you can do a forEach loop and pass a callback into it, and then that callback can be something that you've defined elsewhere, and it just knows how to behave, which lets us encapsulate our code a little bit better. A good example of that is, let's say I had some function, some array, or that's probably not a good idea for forEach. Is Bob. Let's do that. Name. And if the name is Bob, then I'm going to console log Bob. Otherwise, not Bob. Now, you could do, if I had an array of names, and that would be Bob, James, Alice. I could actually do this in a forEach loop, so I could say for const name of names, again, that variable of array, and I could say is Bob name. Pretty nice. Okay, so the first one, it's Bob, it's not Bob, it's not Bob, which is what we'd expect, because this one is Bob. But that has that whole for loop, all that stuff. So instead of this, I can say names.forEach is Bob. If I run this, you can see the second time it runs, which is that forEach loop, it does the same exact thing. That's pretty nice. That's just a single line of code. I have this function. I can reuse this function, which is really important for code. You want to be able to reuse stuff. It doesn't have to be inside a loop like this. If I want to get the index, I can just put it here, and I can say index, and then index. It's not Bob. Oopsie. That's not what I want. So now you can see the first time the index is completely undefined because we don't have it in the for each loop. Index is not a thing that we have availability with. And the second time we have that index. So you can see this is valuable for that particular purpose. So let's derive this. So we want to be able to have a function callback for this particular thing. So we've got our for loop here. Let's just do a simple function. Let's call it forEach, and we'll just pass in the array to well, let's not even pass in the array. And then we can actually just take our code here, pop it in here, and then call it. We see we get that same loop. Okay, so this is not super complicated, right? We've taken a function, we've basically put our for loop inside here, and it just logs that element. Okay, well, let's say we want to do something other than log the element. Maybe we want to call a function instead. So let's say log if even number. So then I can say, okay, if number remainder 2 is equal to 0, console.log number is even. And then we're going to call this here log if even element. Something we might want to do. Now it just logs only the even ones. So now we want to make this a little more generic. And generic means we remove the hard-coded stuff. So we have hard coding right here. So I'm going to call this my forEach. So we have our hard coding here, right? And it's pretty good for what we're doing. But let's say we had a second array that we wanted to use my forEach on as well, and also log if even. So let's say we had array 2 down here, and this one was a different set of numbers. Now, if we call my forEach again, well, there's no way to specify array 2, so it just gives us the same numbers all over again. We want to be able to put array 2 in here and array in here and make that so that it runs over those particular arrays. So in doing that, I'm going to add a parameter to this function. And I'm going to call it array to loop over. And then instead of this, I'm just going to put that in there. I'm going to loop over the parameter passed into the function. So in this case, I'm passing as an argument array, which then gets put into this variable, so we're looping over that. In the second call, I pass in array 2, which becomes this parameter, and we loop over array 2. Slightly more generic. If I run that now, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 14, 16, 18. Cool. But let's say now for my array 2, I want to log if it's odd. And so I want to say it's odd. And I want to have this function be called. Well, what I need to do then is I need to pass in a callback function because I'm hard-coded log is even. So I'm going to say callback function. Put this in here. So now when I call my for array, or my forEach on the first array, I'm going to pass log if even, because remember you can pass a function as an argument to another function, as long as you know it's going to be a function. And then in this case, log if odd. So now when I call this first one, it's going to take array as the array to loop over and log if even as the callback function. In the second one, it's going to take array 2 as the array to loop over and log if odd as the callback function. Okay. But now what if I want the index? So I want the index here at index. Well, in that case, we do have to do a standard for loop. So I'm going to replace this with I equals 0, I is less than array to loop over at length. It's plus const element equals array to loop over I, and then I pass I as the second thing into that callback. Now if I run this, you can see it gets the index. why doesn't this one give the index? Well, because in JavaScript you can call a function with more arguments than it actually intends to receive. So in this case, log of even takes two arguments here, or two parameters, excuse me. It has the number and has the index. Log of odd has one parameter, that being the number. So when I call the callback function, if the callback function is log of even, the element goes into number and I goes into index. If I call the second one log of odd, element goes into number and I just doesn't really go anywhere. You can actually still access it from inside the function, but because we haven't declared a parameter with that name, we just don't have access to it, and that's totally fine in JavaScript. So now we have my forEach. We have a method. It'd be nice though if we didn't have to keep passing in the array. All right, because having that as a parameter is a little annoying. So what we can do instead is we can actually set this as a prototype. And don't worry about this too much, but basically setting this on the prototype means, on the array prototype means every array will have access to it. So if I say array.prototype.myForEach equals myForEach. Now when I come down here, I can actually say array.myForEach and array2.myForEach. This becomes a method that is callable by the array. And it's because each array that I create, this is its parent. And we'll get into object orientation a little bit later in the class. But just bear in mind, whenever you do this, it makes this function or attribute something that's accessible to every array. So if I run that, you can see basically the same thing happens. But I'm still having to pass in the array. So what was the point of this? Well, because I need to get rid of array to loop over. And how do I do that? If I get rid of these two, well, how do I know what I'm looping over? It's going to be this. So array to loop over. Remember, when you call a function with a dot, so array dot, this becomes the context of what you called it as. So if I call array.myForEach, this becomes array. If I call array2.myForEach, this becomes array2. So if I run that now, you can see it still works. And now I have this nice little function that I can just say, hey, array.myForEach with a callback. It goes and loops over the array that I called it on, gets out every element, and calls my callback function with the element and the index. And essentially, if I change this to forEach, you see there's absolutely no difference in the output because this is basically what forEach is doing. All right, so let's move on, keep our arrays here, to filter. What does filter do? So filter essentially says, let's create a new array and let's give it the values only for which the filter function returns true. So a very simplified way is if I wanted to actually filter out all the even numbers, evens, I could create a new array and I could say for element of array, very similar to how we did before, if element less than 2 equals 0, evens.push element. And then if I console.log evens and I run this, you see it's an array now of only the evens. Because basically I've filtered this array. I've said, okay, let me do a check on every single element, and if that check is true, then it goes in here. So let's say I want to do the odds. Odds, I would just do this, not equal. Odds, very similar thing. And if I run this one, and I want to look at array 2 also. And there you can see there's the odds. You know, not super complicated. So let's start to derive this. What do we need to do? Well, first of all, I kind of want to define a function is even element. And this one, instead of printing, console logging like we did before, this is actually going to return. So I'm going to say if element and 2 equals 0, return true. because the condition is true in that case. Otherwise, return false. Note, I don't need to put this in an else case because if we get to line 8, we automatically can assume we never hit this condition, which means we know it's false. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to make another array for is odd. I'm going to say not equal to. And now, in this condition here, I'm going to say if is even element, and if is odd element. Get rid of that. And then if I run this, if is even is not defined. It doesn't like something about that. What have I done here? This is on line 13. Oh, if even. See, I misspelled it. There we go. Now we get what we expect. So now we just made it a little bit more generic. We've got a function that we're calling with the element. So if we were to wrap this in a function and we call it myFilter array, well, we've got kind of the same issue as before, except we need to actually return our evens. Well, actually, no, we don't. We could actually pull this out for now. So now what I can do is I can call myFilter with the array. And let's go down here and let's comment out this little chunk here, and instead let's call myFilter with array2. We run that. Odds is not defined. Oh, because, yeah, that makes sense. We'll leave that out. Okay, so when we run that, you notice we get our evens, but we don't get our odds because this is only handling evens. So we need to actually have a very similar idea of the callback function. But the filter, well, I guess the other thing is the filter needs to actually return this parameter. So let's see, filtered, and then I'm going to say filtered, and then we're going to return filtered. So now I can say, oops, down here, const evens equals myFilter, and here I can say const odds equals myFilter. Right, so now it's actually returning that value so that I can always get a value out of it, and I don't have to have another variable that's outside this function that's keeping track of this stuff, which is nice because if I'm doing a filter, I kind of want it to be self-contained, right? The functions, or the for loop that we had, it required a couple different variables, a bunch of code. This is a single line. Very nice, very sweet. We run that. This doesn't give us the odds. This gives us the evens, and that's because we're still checking is even. So what we want to do is we want to again have a callback function. And I'm actually going to change this array to loop over, just like we had before. And this is actually even simpler. We just replace is even with that callback function. And now in here, we pass in is even, and here we pass in is odd. And we run that, and now you can see we get the odds, and that's because the filter function, we're passing in our callback that we want. So for the first one, we're using is even to do that filtering. The second one we're doing is odd. Now let's do something similar to what we had before. Let's say is the prototype. Prototype dot myFilter. MyFilter. Now I can say array.myFilter and array2.myFilter. And similar to the forEach, we can actually take this out and instead loop over this. Because remember, myFilter is being called in the context of the array, so we have the this that we can count on. So if I run this now, you can see, same exact thing. So now we have myFilter, and if I change this to filter, you can see it's exactly the same. So that's how the array filter function works. Oops. So let's actually get rid of this. Now let's look at map. So we've gone over forEach. We've gone over filter. So let's look at map. What does map do? The purpose behind map is for every single element in the array, it produces another element. So Is even, is odd, probably aren't what we want to do here. So instead, let's do something like, let's double each number, right? So let's say doubles, and then we can again say for each, oops, for const element of array. Something to bear in mind with the filter as well is filters also contain the index. I just didn't do it here. So doubles dot push element times 2. And we console.log doubles. Oops. I'm going to get rid of the second array because I think we don't need that. If we run this now, you can see every number has been doubled. Okay, so let's do something similar. Let's put this into a function. My map array to loop over. Well, actually, let's get to that later. We're just deriving this a little bit. Okay, so we want to return doubles, and then we can say, let's not do that yet. Let's put this on the outside, just because it's simpler. So now we call my map with array. So now we've got a function. The only thing we did different here is now we put this loop inside a function. Same exact thing, same result. So now if we do want to say doubles equals my map, we have to pull this into the function. Remember, the reason we want to do this is we don't want to have this variable kind of outside the method because then it's just sitting there. It's an extra variable we have to deal with. We want a nice clean chunk of code like this. I'm going to call this result array instead. Just update all my things there. So now my map array, we call it, and doubles is the result because we're returning that result out of here. Same thing. Now we need our callback function. So let's say double item element return element times 2. And then now instead of our push here, we're going to say result equals double item element, and then we're going to push that result onto the array. I run that. No difference. Works exactly as we expect. Next thing we want to do is pass in that as a callback function. So now I want to pass in double item as the method. This makes it more generic, and it's pretty easy to do. We just change double item in here to be our callback parameter, and we pass it in as an argument. Uh-oh. Oh, callback function is not a function. Oh, right, because I'm passing in the array as well, which I don't need to be doing. See, you call it with a function or a thing it's not expecting, it doesn't like that. All right, there we go. So now we've got our callback function here. Now, if we want to make array, I'm going to take one step off of this, and I'm just going to add the prototype because you've seen this before. Dot my map equals my map. And then I can say array.mymap and change it to this. And the same thing, it works fine. And so now this code gets hidden somewhere, and now we've got this nice little line here that we can call. There's no extra array outside here that we have to deal with. There's none of that stuff. It's just a very nice, neat, encapsulated thing. And so then again, if we change this to just map, we get the same result because that's essentially the map. So we can call it like this. And that's pretty much how you derive these functions. There's a little bit more complexity with them. All three of them have the index, but you saw how to do that in the forEach. Hopefully this is helpful for some of y'all. The thing to bear in mind with a lot of this stuff, a lot of the ES6 things, is that they're what we call syntactic sugar. They're things that are like they're sweet to have, but they're not required. Just like, you know, a sugary donut. You can accomplish the things that you're doing in these things with regular JavaScript. Most ES6 stuff is like that. However, it just makes things more convenient and makes it a little easier for you to handle it and a little bit easier for you to write code. Yeah, so that's that. Hope you enjoy, and I'll see you all in class.